Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome. I'm going to get started because we haven't got loads of time and we have got a lot of content to get through. So welcome to From the Conference Floor, Real World Lessons for HR Leaders. My name's Gemma McCall and I am the co-founder and CEO of Culture Shift. We're the team behind the report and support platform. And it's an absolute pleasure to host today's session with my colleague who has joined me, who is Charlotte Taylor, who's our training manager here at Culture Shift. Morning, Charlotte.
Hi, everyone.
So, as I say, we're the team behind the report and support platform, which is now used across universities, NHS trusts, and organisations including Channel 4, the Barbican, and the National Theatre. And if you'd like to explore how our platform works, then you can find a demo link that is being shared in the chat now. So, what is today all about? Well, every year we at Culture Shift have an annual conference, and we use this day as an opportunity to host challenging conversations about tackling poor behaviours in the workplace. Because the fact is that no place of work is immune to these issues, and we like to gather people to help improve the ways that HR professionals and organisations as a whole deal with the very thorny and difficult issues of bullying, harassment, and interpersonal conflict. So Charlotte and I facilitated the 8th Culture Shift annual conference earlier this year. And during that day, we heard from all kinds of experts, from employment lawyers, in-house HR leaders, trade union representatives, and workplace culture specialists. And we always want to go beyond the panel discussions that we have there, but we always run out of time on the day. And so what we wanted to do today is delve a little bit deeper into the topics that were shared. So we've collected some of the most interesting and thought-provoking sound bites from those conversations. And today we're going to share them with you, unpacking what they mean in practice and what you as HR leaders can take away and apply right now. So before we dive in, a quick bit of context. I don't need to tell you all that the legal landscape for this work is shifting incredibly fast. The Worker Protection Act came into force in October 2024, which placed a protective duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment. And now in the Employment Rights Act, that takes that duty further, which moves from the standard from reasonable steps to all reasonable steps. And it's introduced employer liability for third-party harassment. So for you folks joining in today, the question can't just be, are we compliant? Because of those new duties and those new expectations, it should definitely focus on the ability to evidence that what you're doing is actually working. We want to move you away from ticking boxes because that basically won't be defensible in court. We've got to be looking at initiatives that actually move the dial on this work. So that is the thread of everything that's running through today. So our first clip comes from Hina Belitz, who is partner at Excelsior Law and an employment lawyer. And she is talking about the reasonable steps defence and what the shift to all reasonable steps means for employers. Let's take a look.
But something that employers all need to be aware of is there is such a thing as a reasonable steps defence. So you can, as an employer, protect yourself from allegations, claims, liability via that defence. And that defence is going to be upped shortly, I believe it's October this year, by making it all reasonable steps. And what it really says is an employer must take reasonable steps to prevent the impact of any kind of discrimination or harassment in order to avoid liability.
Yeah, so Now, under UK law, as Gemma mentioned and as Hina mentioned, employers must be able to evidence that they are taking reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in their workplace. So, not just responding to the reports of sexual harassment that they receive when they receive them. And then this coming October, the legal duty on employers will rise from reasonable steps to all reasonable steps with the introduction of the Employment Rights Act. And one essential reasonable step is implementing comprehensive and regular training for all employees working at different levels of your organisation. To make this training really robust and give it the best chance of leading your organisation to legal compliance with that all reasonable steps requirement, I've seen organisations collate participant feedback from the training that they've implemented and also assess participants after they've completed the training to assess their understanding of sexual harassment. And then they've used that feedback and the outcomes of the assessments to identify gaps in employee understanding of sexual harassment, meaning that when it comes to implementing a refresher training, they can be really intentional about what is included in that refresher training to fill in those gaps in employee understanding. And this kind of approach really demonstrates intent.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's really not enough to have a basic one-off tick box exercise that is too surface level. Employers have got to be intentional about this and really put themselves in a good position for compliance. And part of that is conducting regular routine training that is being understood and kind of lived by the rest of the organization. Employers should also be conducting comprehensive risk assessments and then reviewing those on a regular basis as a reasonable step. That means identifying that if there's a particular risk of sexual harassment in your workplace, putting appropriate mitigations in place. And that really doesn't just mean risk assessing the office. It means thinking about lone working, traveling for work, social events, conferences, any interactions with clients. Without going into that level of detail and documenting it and regularly reviewing it, you're definitely leaving yourself exposed.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned interactions with clients. With the Employment Rights Act, employers in the UK will now be liable for sexual harassment of their staff by third parties. So that includes your clients, customers, contractors, members of the public that your employees might interact with at work, if you failed to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment conducted by third parties. So this now more than ever involves a real level of risk management on behalf of employers. So some steps that I've seen employers take already to meet that legal requirement with regards to third parties is implementing panic alarms or 24/7 helplines for employees who are lone working. If employees are entering houses of members of the public to do their jobs, they can wear body cameras for that extra level of protection. And another great one is only sending employees to conferences or events or client meetings where there has been a shared code of conduct between all of the employers involved, which includes that explicit reference to behaviour expectations on employees and addresses sexual harassment. So the steps that you will take will depend on your unique working environments, but there will always be relatively small steps that you can take to protect your employees from third-party harassment in the workplace. And it is no longer acceptable for employers to ignore or excuse the behaviour of employees from a client or partner organisation in the interest of maintaining good relationships for business, which is something that we've seen happen a lot in the past, and it's really eroded employee trust of their employer. So yeah, something to be mindful of doing this work.
Yeah, definitely. And those are some really strong examples of reasonable steps. And I'd add that following a risk assessment, if you're not sure what risk to take, then you should ask your employees, because they're the ones with the first-hand experience of lone working or being at conferences, etc., etc. And they might be able to suggest things that would genuinely make them feel better and safer. Another critical step is having really comprehensive policies for this area, but making them visible and accessible. That's about the language you use, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, how you signpost to make people aware that they actually exist. Something that we've seen be really effective is that QR codes linking to your policies in shared spaces such as kitchens, break rooms, or on the back of toilet doors are a really effective approach. It is not defensible for you to say, well, the policy was there and they saw it when they first joined the organisation. You have to be seen to be signposting it and making it accessible. The same goes if you have online employee portals or like learning environments. You just have to identify and use all those opportunities to signpost.
Yeah, absolutely. And in those policies, it's also really important to explicitly address online conduct and behaviour expectations on online conduct and virtual sexual harassment. So particularly with the rise in AI generated images being used to inflict harm, and also people more generally just increasingly working online. Ignoring online sexual harassment leaves employers vulnerable to non-compliance with the law. So make sure that that online conduct is explicitly addressed in your policies, and you've got enough in there to sufficiently address it.
Yeah, and that is, you mentioned AI and what you were just saying there. These things are changing rapidly, and so we basically have to ready ourselves to be reviewing and adding to these policies on a really regular basis, because we've got to keep up with the rapidly changing and adapting environment. Which brings us on to our next clip. And this was taken from the panel, which we called "So You've Received a Report of Bullying and Harassment, What's Next?" And our speaker here is Alison Dunn, who is CEO of Citizens Advice Gateshead branch. And she had some interesting advice about formal and informal interactions.
One thing that I think is very interesting is we operate a 7-day service. So Monday to Friday is very much our traditional service where everyone comes into work suited and booted. On a Saturday and Sunday, we have a skeleton staff and it's a much more informal environment. And people's willingness to step in and have quite difficult in disclosing conversations with me on a weekend when I'm just there sort of chilling with them, having a cup of coffee, informally dressed. I have a very, very different quality of conversation in those moments than I often will do on a Monday to Friday in a more formal environment. And depending on what they're telling me, my response will be very nuanced. Sometimes it's coaching in the moment. What can I do to help you with this right now? And sometimes it'll be something which needs quite a bit more. But we don't rush to a procedural response in the same way that my colleagues have just described.
Yeah, so I think that is a really powerful point from Alison. Environment really matters when you're trying to foster a speak up culture where people feel safe enough to speak up about harmful behaviours that they experience at work, such as sexual harassment. And your policy and your formal reporting processes and procedures ultimately don't build the trust of your employees. So it is really important to think about how you can make your employees feel relaxed and comfortable enough to disclose their experiences of harmful behaviour to you as an employer. It could be creating physical spaces and opportunities for these kinds of conversations to happen. For example, dropping coffee mornings. You might even want to think about implementing a process whereby your employees can request to have an informal chat with a manager about something that they've experienced before actually deciding whether or not they want to report an incident formally. Sometimes people just want to tell someone what they've experienced. They want to receive support, have some reassurance. They might want to know more about what their next steps actually could be related to reporting, but they might not want to go straight into making a formal complaint about a colleague and engage in that formal process. So creating ways for employees to be able to have those more informal conversations in the first instance is a great way to build employee trust and to get people to actually speak up about these kinds of harmful behaviours, especially sexual harassment.
Yeah, that piece about building employee trust and encouraging people to speak up is one that employers, I think, often miss. They sort of rush to kind of formal processes because that's kind of where they feel safe, if you like. But when you're proactively creating opportunities and safe spaces for people to disclose harm, you're so much more likely to hear about harmful behaviours before they escalate and have to go through those formal processes. You know, you don't want them to worsen and need formal attention. Ideally, you want to mitigate and kind of head them off at the pass by having kind of an informal conversation. And I just think it's so surprising what can be resolved with an understanding, listening, informal conversation. And employers really shouldn't be afraid of creating those opportunities for disclosures. I think they should seek them out, if anything.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's a really excellent step for an employer to train their people managers explicitly to be able to have those informal, restorative conversations about workplace conflict and harmful behaviour without escalating the conflict. We see it a lot in the workplaces that we work with where there's one or two trusted managers who receive all of the disclosures from employees about harmful behaviours, which is good to an extent, but we want ideally to have as many managers as possible to be trusted with these kind of disclosures in our workplace. And training is a really key step to achieving that. And of course, we do appreciate that not all harmful behaviour and instances of sexual harassment that happens at work can be appropriately resolved with informal restorative conversations. But sometimes it is. And sometimes workplace conflict can be resolved with a coaching approach. So this is something that you could consider training your managers in too.
Yeah, absolutely. So next we're heading back to Hina and we're going to talk about how organizations can move beyond just having a policy on paper. And this was a really big theme at the conference, the gap between having a policy and actually embedding it. So this is what Hina had to say about that.
But one thing that we always say, ways in which you can try and protect and support an organization to manage these issues. One of the obvious ones is policies. Policies are really, really important and to have them right. But a policy, and there's case law on this, a policy that is dead in a book or in the bottom drawer is of no value. And a case that I often teach upon literally said, well, we're going to disregard that because they might have been made aware initially, but in years they've not had a refresh of what the standards are expected of them.
Yeah, so this builds on what we spoke about earlier about the importance of not just having a policy, but keeping your policy alive and making sure that your people know about it. So routine training and refresher training brings policies to life and really embeds knowledge of the policy in your employees. It's good practice to actually encourage your employees to access your policy within a training session or a team meeting and navigate it so they're familiar with it should they ever need to use it. And I've seen some really excellent training sessions or workshops where employees are actually encouraged to analyse the policy in groups within the session and highlight where they think the policy could be improved or where they are a bit confused about what the policy actually means. And this has led to really excellent discussion and learning in employees.
Yeah, I think that's a really excellent way to ensure that your employees know that you're taking the work seriously, and it also helps them feel really involved in creating the policies and the speak up culture within the workplace. And I think that it's really important that your policies are looked at and used, because if harmful behaviour happens in every workplace, which realistically it absolutely does, but you're never getting any reports, then the trust is low. It doesn't mean that the workplace is perfect. It means that you're just not finding out about that behaviour.
Yeah, exactly. And I think if you find yourself in a position where you are called upon to evidence and explain how you are compliant with the law that we've spoken about today, and you can say, we have this policy, and X amount of employees have used this to report harmful behaviour to us, and here is exactly how we responded to and managed those reports, then this is far better than having no reports, because there is no awareness of your policies amongst your employees. So it is really key to ensure that you are communicating regularly with your employees about those policies to raise awareness of them.
Yeah, 100%. So just to kind of build on that policy point, something we heard about loud and clear from practitioners at the conference is the importance of language. So let's hear this clip from Jenny Gradwell, who is advice and response at the University of Manchester.
I'm very passionate about plain language and accessibility. We've taken a lot of steps at the University of Manchester in recent years to kind of de-legalishify word I just made up a lot of our policies and processes and really make them much plainer in language.
Yeah, so I have supported people through making reports in the workplace before, and my experience in doing that reflects what Jenny just mentioned. So use of complex legal language can be really daunting for people who are thinking about reporting harmful behaviour they've experienced at work. They're already experiencing a really pivotal, highly emotional, difficult time, having just experienced, for example, sexual harassment in the workplace, and then reading through long, wordy, legalistic policies can be really overwhelming and can cause them ultimately to shut down and decide not to speak up about their experience. So it really does put people off speaking up.
Yeah, and we've got an example actually, like a real example of exactly what Jenny was talking about. So this is specifically the academic appeals policy at the University of Manchester. And I think, you know, when employees or in this case students are reading through a highly legalistic policy, you can see from this language here it's so easy to misunderstand it, and there is a danger that they're sort of heading into the reporting process, if that is then they still decide to report, and then the process is different to what they've expected in heading into it because they haven't properly understood what the process is. So therefore they lose trust in the process. And the problem with that is that if the process lets down one individual, they will tell others about it. And that is then really difficult to kind of move back and turn things back around from. So it's really important that processes and policies are really easy to understand. But as you can see here, the old version, you know, reads like there that exists or existed circumstances affecting the student's performance for which a credible and compelling reason, blah, 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 blah. The new version is so much shorter, says the same thing, but is in such, you know, much easier language to digest and understand. So when someone is considering reporting something, in this case, challenging a decision that affects their academic future, the language itself as Charlotte was saying, is a gateway to the next step. And if it reads like it was drafted by lawyers for lawyers, it creates that immediate power imbalance. It makes it inaccessible. So I just think it's really, really important. And plain language doesn't mean that we're dumbing down the policy. That new Manchester policy still covers the same legal ground. But what it does do is it shifts the relationship from we've published our rules, good luck, to we want you to understand how this works and make this accessible. And that shift in tone signals something about the organisational culture, that the process exists to serve the people who want to be part of the process, not just to protect the organisation.
Yeah, and this is why I'm such a fan of a one-pager or even a flow chart to explain your reporting process. It is really powerful in building that understanding, managing expectations around what actually happens in your reporting process. And when employees know exactly what they can expect from your reporting process and you actually meet those expectations, then you really start to build employee trust in your speak up process.
Yeah, definitely. And this policy was co-created with taking the kind of the policy before, and then taking it to a group of students. I can't quite remember what Jenny said the group was, but it was a group of students who literally went through it line by line and went either I don't understand that or can you explain that to me, and I think it's a much stronger policy for it. And so talking about co-creation and bringing your people along the journey, it was also another strong theme at the conference. And so this next clip is from Anna Spragg, who is the head of people experience and inclusion at the Institute of Development Studies, which talks exactly about that point.
I think the kind of comms and engagement point is really big. So we tried to kind of, when we were developing our everything around this project, we actually did as much co-creation and engagement as we could, sort of bringing people along on the journey from the outset. So they were kind of involved in the development of what we were actually delivering. So, and we're particularly trade unionised as well. So we definitely needed to bring them on board and work with them.
Yeah, so I worked with Anna actually on implementing her speak up process at IDS. And I think that some level of co-creation when you're designing your speak up process is so important. You need to understand your employees and the barriers that they are experiencing to speaking up about harmful behaviours in your workplace, so that you can design a speak up process which intentionally works against these barriers and builds their trust. It's especially important if you know that you have a culture in your organisation where your current speak up process is mistrusted, and you know that you actually really need to take steps to rebuild the trust of your employees, then co-creation should be an absolute focus for you. Bringing everybody along on the journey, developing that speak up process is a great first step to rebuilding employee trust.
Yeah, I totally agree with all that. It really kind of sets you out on the on rebuilding that trust. But I think also that co-creation does need to be well defined. I think it does need to have certain limits and be well managed by you, because sometimes what we find is that organizations strive for absolute perfection from the outset. And they won't start listening and won't start launching a new speak up platform or process until they've got absolute full approval from everyone and engaged every single possible stakeholder. Or this is the one that we see most often, to be honest, is planned for every conceivable eventuality. And you're never, if you're kind of waiting for that moment of perfection, you're never going to be ready, basically. And what we've found is that it's often better to launch, iterate and adapt and refine those processes along the way, and demonstrate that you're continuously being responsive to employee needs and the kinds of reports that you're receiving, that getting started is better than that kind of perfection paralysis, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think, yeah, it's important to remember that refining your speak up process can be a journey. You don't need everything to be perfect before launching it. You can just launch it, see what reports you actually get, and gather feedback on reporter experiences. And then, as you said, Gemma, adapt your response process along the way. And it can be a really interesting learning journey. And I think you can also have a real sense of an understanding then of what workplace culture you actually have through doing that.
Yeah, and it's constantly living that commitment to co-creation. You don't just like have it with your policies and say, oh, I want your feedback on this, right? I don't want your feedback anymore. That co-creation, that trust building is just a constant kind of building and iterative process. So we're going to move on to an area now that generated quite a lot of engaged discussions at the conference, which is protected beliefs and how to navigate situations where rights come into conflict. I think this is one of the trickiest areas for HR leaders right now to get right. So let's hear from Gareth Matthews, who is a partner at the law firm HF.
It used to very much be that you'd maybe have a narrower set of beliefs that might be protected, or that was kind of the perception. Very much all the cases that we're seeing come through are absolutely telling us that almost every belief, unless it's at the most extreme end where it's, you know, it's encouraging violence or hatred and that kind of thing, in its extreme forms, unless it's in that category, almost every belief is likely to be protected. Now, that doesn't mean every manifestation of that belief is going to be protected. In fact, far from it. But the belief itself is always likely to be protected.
Yeah, so I think it's important for employers to be quite risk averse in this area and apply a very broad interpretation of what we mean by belief and what beliefs are protected. So, for example, we have the local elections tomorrow, and people are going to have different political beliefs, and this is likely to spark conversations in your workplaces and potentially lead to workplace conflict. And whilst political beliefs aren't a specific protected characteristic under the Equality Act currently, the case law is increasingly mixed and is always developing in this area, with what some people might consider to be a political belief being captured by the Equality Act under that religion and belief category if it meets certain criteria.
Yeah, so the courts have been increasingly willing to accommodate political beliefs within this framework, including gender critical beliefs. In Miller and the University of Bristol back in 2024, we also saw anti-Zionism judged as a protected philosophical belief under the Equality Act. And I just say, think carefully about acting in these circumstances. I think we have to step back, ask ourselves the question, is this action I'm going to take against the employee's belief itself, or is it against an inappropriate manifestation of that belief in the workplace? And then the sort of strongest kind of bit of advice, if you like, that we could give is document your reasoning for that decision. And just keep it documented specifically in relation to this question, with the thought that if I have to justify this action in court, like, is it defensible within that legal context?
Yeah, and to build on that as well, I'd also say build an understanding of the impact of disability, particularly neurodiversity in relation to cases of conflicting rights. So in 2025, the number of employment tribunal cases involving neurodiversity in the UK surged from 102 to 183. In general, non-visible disabilities such as ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and also dyspraxia are misunderstood in the workplace, and this can lead to complexity when dealing with cases of conflicting rights. So recently, at the Employment Tribunal in Manchester, we saw an employee win a case against their employer for discrimination arising from disability and indirect disability discrimination. This followed the claimant being treated unfairly after misgendering a trans colleague persistently in the workplace. And the claimant had explained to her employer that the misgendering was as a result of her dyspraxia, but this reasoning was unfairly dismissed and not given enough consideration or weighting in the investigation process. And the claimant was isolated from her team and unjustifiably taken off projects as a result. So when you are considering these kinds of cases involving conflicting rights, always seek out to understand any disability involved in the case and its potential impact on the situation.
Yeah, I think it's really important to be committed to be proactive about this. Employers can build a better understanding of neurodiversity in your places of work and the potential impact in general, and also, where possible, an understanding of how neurodiversity impacts individual employees at work. So let's hear about another perspective on this from Hina.
And this has come out of a lot of sort of guidance and case law, is not to assume that someone who has a belief is going to be a problem, because it's all about what they do with that belief. And everyone does hold different beliefs, and a lot of times you may never know what they believe, but it's the manifestation of the belief, and it's also how they behave or treat others with respect to that belief.
Yeah, so embracing diversity of beliefs in the workplace is so important. It is where behaviour amounts to harassment or hate speech in the workplace where it becomes a problem. And that, I think, is a really key takeaway from today, and something that we should be mindful of and focus on.
Yeah, it's definitely not easy, especially with all of the different rulings across different tribunal courts across the UK at the moment. And so I think it's, document and proceed with caution, and having a reporting platform or a speaking process that is trusted and used by your employees for them to speak up if they feel unsafe or uncomfortable, or if they feel like their belief is being undermined or is being sort of unprotected. This way, in having a used and adopted speak up process, this is the way that we can hopefully hear about behaviours before they escalate and cause a hostile working environment for someone.
Yeah, and we've also, as well as the use of reporting, we've also seen mediation used as a tool to navigate cases of conflicting rights in the workplace, to support colleagues to express their feelings and views and better understand their colleagues' perspective, with a view to rebuilding a working relationship despite their conflicting perspectives or beliefs. So mediation should always be conducted by somebody who is trained and unbiased in the situation. It also requires all parties involved to consent to the process and engage in the process enthusiastically. So people shouldn't be forced to engage in mediation, as this is counterproductive in terms of the outputs that you will get.
Yeah, definitely. And each party definitely has to be willing to be part of that conversation. And if they're not, mediation is not the right route for that particular situation. I think it's also really important to flag that any investigations are undertaken by someone who's appropriately impartial and distanced from the situation, so that the process itself can be as unbiased and objective as possible, both in the moment in the hope to resolve it, but also thinking about sort of the worst case scenario, if it goes to a tribunal, being able to demonstrate that you have been unbiased and as objective in your approach from the organisation's perspective.
Yeah, that is absolutely critical. So in the employment tribunal case in Manchester that I referred to earlier, it was found that the internal investigation was conducted by the line manager of the claimant, who was also the line manager of the person who had been misgendered. And this was judged at tribunal to be completely inappropriate. So just to reiterate what Gemma said, think about who you have conducting your investigations and how could you explain that this person is appropriately unbiased in this context if you had to justify that in a tribunal situation.
Definitely. I don't there's a question in the chat asking what that case was, please. If you don't have it to hand, Charlotte, then we can send you that afterwards in the follow-up when we share the recording and everything.
Yeah.
And that is really key, basically. Documentation, being able, being unbiased in your approach. I think people focus like heavily on making the right decision and reaching the right conclusion, but it's about that process and about that everything and what you do to get there, the choices you make, and then how you can explain them and justify them. And I guess this comes down is what we need to be is human-centered when devising and designing our people's processes. And we've got Hina again here, a lot of wisdom coming from Hina on conference day about having a kind of human-centered process.
Very often people, it's by mismanagement or not addressing issues that things can go terribly wrong. So simply moving people away from each other or trying to find a solution, which is a human solution, can be really powerful.
So yeah, I think restructuring teams or separating people in the workplace so that they don't have to work closely together, as Hina mentioned, definitely does have its place. But where possible, it should be considered a later resort. So I would always advocate for exploring mediation or those restorative conversations in the first instance, if this is appropriate, to support people to be able to work together again, especially in cases of conflicting beliefs. However, this won't always be appropriate. And of course, you've got to consider safety and risk as paramount when you're making those decisions.
Yeah, definitely. Like often when we separate the people in the workplace or restructure teams so that people don't have to work closely together again, we don't factor in the fact that the hostility remains. We move the people apart, but the issue itself goes unresolved, and other colleagues then may feel it, and it will have a knock-on impact in the workplace culture. So where possible, address these issues rather than just passing on the problem. So I'm really conscious of time, and I'm really pleased that we've kind of be able to highlight some of those things from conference today. And just, we've covered quite a lot of ground today, straight from the conference floor, from the legal shift to all reasonable steps, to third-party harassment, building trust through informal spaces, keeping policies alive, simplifying language, co-creation, navigating protected beliefs and conflicting rights, getting your processes right, and the complexities of all of that. And the thread running through all of that is that tick boxing and compliance alone is not enough. What matters is that you are building genuine trust, and that's a trust that your people will speak up, trust that they'll be heard, trust that something meaningful will be done. And that takes intentional, ongoing work. And it also takes a culture where safety and respect are the baseline, not the afterthought.
I've also just dropped the case in the chat for the person who asked for that.
Oh, thank you. It's really helpful. Thank you. So thank you to everyone that joined us today. If you'd like to explore how culture shift and report and support can help your organisation put these lessons into practice, please do reach out. Sinead's contact details have been shared in the chat. We'd absolutely love to hear your questions. So please ask, and we can follow up with the recording afterwards. And thanks so much for joining this Lunch and Learn session, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thanks, everyone.